Jojo, welcome to Waterstones.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to do that horrible thing now, but you're very practiced at this. How would you pitch We All Live Here?
Ooh, okay. It's a comedic book about a very messy modern family and what happens when an extra element is dropped into that family at a crisis point.
See, I knew you'd be good at this. You're well practiced.
I'm not actually. That was the first time I pitched it, so thank you.
I would describe this very much as a character-driven book. You have got a lovely cast of characters and they're incredibly well drawn. They're well rounded and they're really distinct, if you see what I mean. And that's harder than it sounds, I think. But the book is primarily narrated by Leela, but not entirely. And her daughter Celie also has some chapters. And so I wanted to ask, first of all, why? So why do you have that sort of split narrative, and how did you decide how to tell the story?
Well, firstly, it's really hard to tell an entire story with twists purely through the eyes of one character. But secondly, part of this book is about the assumptions that we make about other people's behaviour and how we very rarely actually have a clue what's going on. I'm fascinated. There's a book by Will Storr called Story, which you're probably familiar with, where he talks about, from a psychological basis, how humans believe that we are really good at understanding other people's motivations, and actually we're terrible at it. And I think in most families we assume motivations or behaviours, that we understand behaviours, when actually we don't, especially when it comes to teenagers. So in Celie's case, I wanted you to look at her behaviour from the outside and go, well, what that girl needs is a good talking to, or, you know, she needs more structure, she needs more routine. But when you see the world from Celie's viewpoint in those few chapters, you start to understand why she's behaving in the way she is and the very particular challenges that she is facing, but also the role that Jean, her grandfather, plays in helping her out of her stuck place. And that has to be unseen by Lila for the plot to work.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons why those 3 chapters are the way they are.
We're going to come to Jean later, because he is a fantastic character and you clearly had a lot of fun writing him. I was really intrigued, I suppose, by the energy that exists at the beginning of the book, and I was trying to work out what it felt like, and it's almost like a bomb has gone off in Lila's life. She has had her marriage fall apart rather publicly and sort of shamefully, and she's lost her mum. And she clearly had a great relationship with her mum, and her mum was a real character, and that's a real loss. And that vacuum that this explosion has left behind is sort of filled with this energy, which is a fascinating thing to have driving a narrative. Could you tell me a little bit about, I suppose, that energy and writing it?
I think it comes from my career as a journalist, because I covered so many big news events when I worked for The Independent. I was a news reporter for 10 years. And what I found fascinated me more and more, the more reporting I did, was not the murder in the hotel room, but the chambermaid who had to clear it up afterwards. Or, you know, I covered it, like I remember covering a coach crash, and you're full of adrenaline when you're walking around counting dead bodies. Like I was literally on a grass verge looking at hands and feet and thinking, okay, my news editor needs to know how many people are dead. And you go into this kind of very professional, almost like a cold mode. But then afterwards, what hits you is every single one of those people had a family, and you're filled with the kind of grief of it. And so you're absolutely right. At the start of this book, a bomb has gone off, but you're still in the kind of ringing centre of it. You're not out the other side. It's not that any of this grief or anger has been processed. It's all completely bubbling up to the surface. And Lila especially does not have the self-awareness to understand how she's reacting. And I think, as someone who's fascinated by psychology, which informs a lot of this book, because you said it's a character study, it really is. I'm so interested in people's brains and how they work. Lila has to reach a place where she understands what's going on with her and how she shows up in the rest of the book in terms of how well her family can cope with the aftermath.
I'm going to be really careful, I hope, to not spoil any details of the plot, because you really want to enjoy it as you read it. But this is a book in many ways about different kinds of love.
Yes.
There is familial love, step familial love, estranged love, platonic, romantic.
Yeah.
Those are all very, very different things. And I wondered, I suppose, which you had the most fun writing, or which was the most enjoyable?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I don't think I could single one thing out. What fascinates me increasingly is relationships. It's how we show up for each other. And I'm in my 50s now, and I think the thing that happens to you once you hit middle age is you have to have a reckoning with yourself. You have to look at, well, or you don't, in which case you careen off into your later years, kind of probably doing a lot of damage to everybody around you. But if you don't want to do that, you have to look at yourself and go, okay, how is my behaviour affecting this? How I can feel aggrieved by how various family members have shown up in my life, but how do I navigate the next part of my life and move forward with forgiveness? Because it is essentially a book about forgiveness in a lot of ways. It's about whether we can and how we do it. And sorry, that was a really rambling answer to your question.
We are here for rambling answers. Okay. That is what we want. There is no easy answer to these questions.
No, that's true.
This is what makes books interesting. Yeah. We mentioned Jean earlier,
yes.
And Lila's lost her mother, and therefore she's now sort of weirdly living with her stepfather.
Yeah.
And Jean is her biological father, but has been absent for much of her life. And in many ways has been a terrible dad.
Terrible.
And probably an even worse granddad. He's just not been there. But it's clear to me that you have a lot of affection for Jean. And tell me a little bit, I suppose, about why he's so fun to write, and actually what his more positive attributes are, why it's so important that he does appear, I suppose, in the book.
I suppose, having worked in Hollywood on and off for the last 15 years, I'm slightly fascinated by a certain variety of actor who basically never quite gets over themselves, especially those who've had success in their early years.
Yeah.
And Jean is basically he's an actor who had big success in his, I would say, his 20s and 30s with a Star Trek knockoff, and has never got over himself since. Yeah. And by the time we meet him, he's exhausted every line of credit, every tolerant ex-girlfriend, every possible avenue he had to continue his life, and he's landed on Lila's doorstep. But it's so much fun to write a giant man baby. You know, Jean is entirely driven by ego at the beginning of the book. He needs to be the centre of attention still. You know, he's in his 70s, but he's still vain and silly. And the thing that was most fun to write was the unresolved feud between him and Bill, the stepdad, who have basically despised each other for 35 years and still cannot let it go, even though the object of their joint affections is now dead, and, you know, was never, you know, they were never directly in competition. But I just love that thing of, there's something intrinsically funny about old men fighting, and I don't know what it is. And I did for a while consider making those two characters female. Yeah. And it just wasn't as funny. Yeah. It just wasn't as funny. It would have been such a different dynamic. And there's a scene where they actually have a bit of a physical fight, which was so joyful to write because it's so petty and stupid. But the thing I loved about Jean, and he is one of those characters who I was lucky enough that he just fell into my head. Sometimes you get that. I would say about once every 5 books you get one of those characters who just arrives fully formed. Like, I can picture him now. Yeah. I know how he would be in this room. And he was just a joy to write. I was so sad to end this book, mostly because of him, and I'm slightly wondering if I can resurrect him in some form. I don't think it's a spoiler alert to say I didn't kill him, like I do to lots of characters. But what you realise during the book, again, this thing of not fully knowing someone's motivations, what you see, especially through his relationship with Celie, his eldest granddaughter, is that he has a lot to offer, and he also has enough self-awareness to know he's really messed up and is trying to make things better in his clumsy, still quite egotistical, you know, chaotic way. I think if he was around now, he'd be diagnosed with ADHD. Yep. He's probably lost a fair few brain cells through drug use. And in his head, he's still 14. He's wearing a Grateful Dead T-shirt and getting stoned occasionally. But he was the most fun character I've written in years. I loved every second with him.
And as you say, that relationship he has with Bill, I was thinking, I don't feel like I've read this kind of relationship in the book.
I hope you haven't.
These kind of like butting stag heads, but really not butting heads very well.
No, and they're really petty.
Yeah.
Like there's an argument over a pair of socks, and when Bill brings home an adoring woman, his first date, he can't quite leave it alone.
Yeah.
Jean has to sort of intervene and put him down a bit and flirt with the way it's just, this ego is front and center of everything. And that was a lot of fun to write.
But as you say, he has something really important to offer, particularly to Celie. And it made me really think about, as you say, how people interact with each other. And it made me think that maybe the secret to happiness was that rather than trying to change the things about people that wind you up, to focus instead on the things that they can offer you. So what is the thing about Jean that is actually really useful? Mm-hmm. And if you could accept people for those positive attributes instead of trying to change everybody to be, I don't know, a clone of the sort of person that you like to have in your life, maybe life would be more
Can we just
interesting.
frame that little sentence and hang it in neon?
Let's do it.
Over every front door? Because I totally agree. That is the secret. It's acceptance. I mean, every Buddhist text, every religious text has in it, well, maybe not all of them, some variation on that theme, which is you have to meet people where they are, or else it's you who is going to be driven crazy. And once Lila is able to let go of all the ways in which her father has let her down, her relationship with him starts to change. Even in her relationship with Bill, her stepdad, who, when we meet him at the beginning, is driving her slightly crazy because, like a lot of people in their later years, he has very firm ideas about how things should be done and what he needs to exist in a space, and it doesn't really tally with a household of two chaotic girls and a slightly embittered middle-aged woman and a barking dog.
Yeah. For Lila, there's a really interesting thing with her writing, which is that she is having to negotiate this line between creativity and her personal life, and wondering how much of each to put in the book. How do you negotiate that particular line yourself? Is everything a purely fictional creation, or is there elements of your life that creep in?
I think I've never written a book. I think I've written 17 or 18 that I haven't at a later date found some element of myself in. Sometimes it's a wannabe thing, like I want to be stronger, so I write a strong woman who, isn't afraid of things. Or I once wrote a book many years ago about a child who had died, and then at the end of the book you discover that the child hadn't died, which I know sounds like a reach, but you have to read the book. It's called Silver Bay, available from all good retailers, Waterstones especially. But what I realised with hindsight, my youngest was facing a big operation when I wrote that book that I was terrified about. And what I realised my subconscious was doing was making the worst possible case scenario happen and then giving it a happy ending. So yes, I think there is an element of me in everything. I don't think there's much of me in Jean, I'll be honest. But you and also you have preoccupations that inform what you choose to write about at any given time. It's no coincidence that I wrote The Giver of Stars at the beginning of the last Trump presidency. And it's about knowledge and facts and the importance of pushing back against a patriarchy and the rape of the landscape. It's all those things. Right now, I'm really fascinated by psychology, so I wanted to write a character study. I wanted to write a tiny canvas about one family. And I got divorced a few years ago. Beyond that, there's no similarities with me and Lila. I'm on very good terms with my ex, and my kids are not anything like Celie and, oh my God, I've forgotten her name. This happens to me every time.
Second child.
The second child. The young one who knows all the really dodgy rap lyrics. Violet. This is the terrible thing about being a writer. Your brain moves immediately onto your next word. And then I'm amazed I can even talk to you about this. So yes, this is a very elongated way of saying, yes, there are definitely elements of me in every book. I just don't always know which they are until a few years later.
That's really interesting, yeah, that it's only with hindsight you go, oh, that's what I was actually writing about.
I remember I wrote a book called The Peacock Emporium, which was about a young woman who opened a shop in a market town and how she didn't fit in. I wrote that 2 years after I'd moved to a market town and couldn't quite adapt to the life there, or felt I couldn't. Again, she bore no resemblance to me physically or in the plot or whatever, but yeah, sure, of course I was processing something without realising it.
You mentioned there that you've written a lot of books, and in fact on the back of the proof that I was sent, there are some very impressive stats. We're talking about millions of copies sold all over the world, translated into many languages, many #1 spots secured, which makes it sound like you have always been a huge success. And I suppose in my head that's what I think of you as being. But that's not the case for you. That you wrote, I think, was it 3 novels you wrote before even finding a publisher?
One published, and then I wrote 8 books before I had a bestseller.
Now, so this is interesting on 2 levels. First of all, I think with the 4th book, you sort of said to yourself, if this doesn't find a publisher, I'll do something else.
Yeah.
So my first question is, if it hadn't, what would you have done as a career? What would you have been if you weren't?
Well, I was a journalist when I was writing them, so I would have just stayed in journalism. But I was pregnant with my 2nd child when I wrote number 4, and it was very hard balancing the needs of the job with having young children. I can't recommend it, and that's with a supportive partner who worked in the same place as me. But it was impossible. I think it would be more impossible now because of the demands of 24-hour news, which we at least had a cut-off date in the late 90s, which was the paper went to bed, and that was it. Now it doesn't. If I couldn't, I think I would have written another book somehow, because I think that's how I process the world. But if I couldn't be a journalist, I think I would have trained as a psychologist.
Right.
Because that's the thing that is endlessly fascinating to me. It's why we do the things we do, why we fall into the patterns we fall into, how our childhoods show up in everything, annoying as that is. It fascinates me. And I think it's become more of a societal preoccupation now as well, because I think we're understanding more about brain chemistry and neurodiversity and, stupid stuff like my brother told me a few months ago that he couldn't see things in his head.
Right, yes.
And it's called something like anaphasia.
Yes.
And that blew my mind because you suddenly realise this person who I think I know really well actually experiences the world in a totally different way to me. And I really wish that we could just sit inside each other's heads a bit to kind of see what it's like in there, because I think it would lead to so much more understanding. Yeah,
absolutely. I had exactly the same thing. A friend had the same diagnosis, had discovered, oh, wait, are you telling me
pictures?
Like you don't, and that is, as you say, completely mind-blowing to think you see the world in a completely different way to how I do.
Yes.
And the impact of that
exactly
on almost everything you do.
And you think of, years ago, kids who were left-handed were sort of beaten until they learned to do it with their right hand. Or I remember, I went to primary school in the 70s, and there were kids who would rock on their chairs for the whole school day, and clearly were traumatized by something bloody awful, but nobody, it's just Mark, just, he always does that, or that's so-and-so who comes to school with bruises. We had so little awareness, and now I have a lot of hope that we're a lot kinder to children and to adults. I'm a great believer in all these adult ADHD diagnoses, because I know loads of people for whom it has made a phenomenal difference, and there is a grieving process to go through when they realise the impact it's had on them. There's so many neurodiverse conditions that have huge impacts. I did a writing course with the BBC where I included a creativity coach who I'd spoken to, sorry, is this a bit of a diversion?
This is great, we love a diversion.
Because she said my years in journalism had given me the ability to sit down at my desk at any given time of the day, and my neural pathways are so coated in what's called a myelin sheath that they can't be washed away. So my brain knows at the moment I sit down at a desk, it's time to write.
Yeah.
So I don't get writer's block, touch wood. I just do my job. I have no problem doing that. And people who've got ADHD have been told their whole lives, you know, stop fidgeting, you're so useless. And for them, it's all about building up dopamine associations with the act of sitting down at a desk so that they can build their own myelin sheaths through repetition, but the repetition is only going to come with the dopamine because task initiation is so much harder for them. To me, it blows my mind because just because my brain can make me sit at a desk and do it doesn't mean that I can force that on my kids or anybody else. It's just, I feel like the whole world of brain chemistry and how we understand it is exploding, and it's really important with regards to creativity, because I think of all the writers who aren't able to get their thoughts out because of exactly this. They can't sit in front of a desk.
It's fascinating.
It is, isn't it?
And as we were saying earlier, after book 4 did pick up its publisher, it was a while before, I guess, huge success comes. And of course, huge success doesn't come to every writer, but it did come to you. Is pre-bestseller Jojo any different to post-bestseller Jojo?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Tell me how.
There is a confidence that comes with people reading what you write, because I wrote 8 books that not many people read at the time that they were published anyway, and I was also conscious of being a bit of a disappointment to my then publishers, because you put your heart and soul into every book, and then everybody has high hopes, and you pick the cover and you pick the marketing plan and all the rest of it, and then it just goes bleh. And it's awful. It's awful. I'm disappointed, but I'm also the kind of person that's much more anxious about disappointing the people who are paying me. So for 8 years, 9 years, maybe 10, I just felt like a bit of a disappointment, and it made me feel terrible. And then the lovely thing that happened with the success of Me Before You, not just that success, but people discovered the backlist.
Right.
And it was so validating, because you suddenly go, oh, they weren't bad books. Yes, they were very different from each other, which made me very difficult to market, but people loved those books. And as a writer, all you want is for people to read your stuff. Like, that's all you want. And then to have that happen, and happen on a scale, has been the gift of my life, honestly. Sorry, kids. No, not
Whatever
really.
your names are.
I've forgotten. But it has been an actual profound gift. And psychologically, I find it really interesting, because I have a running joke with my best friend. We've been friends since we were 16, and we are both the kind of people that if success went away tomorrow, or if our money disappeared or whatever, we would stack shelves in Tesco's. Absolutely no problem, or an equivalent job. I just have no problem. I'm a grafter. I have been since I was 14. And some people just can't. And it's not just ego, it's about your kind of more fragile sense of who you are. And because of what I've done in my life, and because of this astonishing success of the books, I know who I am, I know what I've done, and it gives you a kind of quiet confidence that enables you to do quite crappy things sometimes, not to people, but like, you know, and I get, I'm small, I'm blonde, I'm not a flashy dresser. So say I go into a car showroom, 9 times out of 10 I'm going to get patronised, I'm going to get walked past, and it enables me to just give it a wry smile and think quietly to myself, well, I could buy you. And I just don't get wound up about that kind of stuff, because that success, that fictional success in fiction, it has given me this kind of absolute iron core of confidence that I think if I, as a middle-aged woman, if I hadn't had that, I might be quite a different person.
You've also always been very supportive of other writers, particularly young writers. In fact, you mentioned earlier that idea of your awareness, actually, of how neurodiversity might impact people's ability to be creative. And so you're aware of that. You were part of the quick reads initiative and things like that. Do you think that would always have been the case, or is there something about having had success come a little bit later in life that makes you aware of what people need?
Definitely. And also, there's a weird guilt thing. It's like a survivor guilt, because I know how tough it is to succeed in writing. Lots of my friends have not made the strides that I've made. I have been extraordinarily fortunate. I mean, it's something I think about every single day, and it came to me in my 40s. So yes, I think you do have to put the ladder down behind you, and it's not just a guilt thing, it's also a pleasurable thing. Like a few years ago I had in my old house I had a cottage attached to the house, and I Airbnb'd it for a while. It was the most miserable experience of my existence. You know, there I am scrubbing baby pee out of a sheet that one of the guests had kind of dunked and left me with, and you know, I was thinking, this isn't even my job, why am I doing this? So I did this thing where I gave it to up and coming writers, or me and my then husband did it, and we did a scheme where people could apply, and we would pay for their transport costs, and they could have the cottage, which was in a very safe environment, because don't underestimate like what that means to a lot of women, especially, to have a space of their own that's safe and quiet, and the freedom from responsibility. We'd fill the cottage with food so that they didn't have to go anywhere, and they just got to write. And our first person to do that scheme was Candice Carty-Williams, who's gone on to become an absolute megastar. I mean, I'm sure she would have got there without it, but I got such pleasure from that scheme, from the people that we had passed through, and it just makes you feel a bit less sort of weird about your own weird level of success. And then the quick reads thing was similar, which is the one thing I recognise is my parents taught me to read when I was really young, and so from 3 I was a reader, and that has been the thing that has shaped my entire life, and that of my children, and that of loads of people around me. So I understand how fundamentally important it is to have a love of reading, and frankly the ability to read, because I was shocked when I discovered the levels of illiteracy in this country. It is an epidemic. So to be able to fund that for 3 years was also a gift. I mean, I'm not great at being part of boards and charities and meetings and stuff. That's not my bag, but it was good. I think it has different funding now, but it was good to kind of bridge that gap.
To bring it back to the book, We All Live Here, we mentioned earlier a bit about some of the characters, and they all go on these fantastic journeys. What do you hope readers might take away from it? We mentioned acceptance earlier, but is that the main message, or is there something else that you hope that people would take away?
Honestly, I think it's just a bit of joy. Since Giver of Stars, which was quite a serious book and contained a lot of political themes, and which I felt was my most personal book, that to me dredged up everything that I cared about, and I couldn't write for about 9 months after I wrote that. It was like giving birth, if that doesn't sound horribly pretentious. It was just, it was literally, I loved every minute of writing it. It was written in a very different language to the one I usually write in, and it was a very personal book. And maybe because it happened at quite a kind of difficult personal time for me, it just had a big resonance. And then after that, I thought, I need to write lighter. And then we had the pandemic, and all I wanted to watch was things that were going to make me feel a bit better about the world. And yes, this contains some difficult themes. It's got bullying, it's got, you know, all sorts of bad behaviour within this family. But it's also ultimately a joyful book. I think it's about finding love in unexpected places, even from people you thought incapable of giving it. And it's got a lot of humour in it, and I love making people laugh. It's a thing I only discovered from Me Before You onwards. But if I can make someone laugh and cry in the same book, I feel like I've, you know, do a little victory dance down the road. It just makes me really happy. When people say, oh, I really cried at this book, I really laughed, I'm just going to soak that up. Just love it.
And now you've teased that we may get to see more of Jean in some way in the future.
I can't work out what to do with him yet, but yeah, some characters you know you're going to revisit
We won't make you commit to anything right now, but we have him in this book. It's an absolute joy.
Well, I've said it now.
Yeah. Jojo, thank you so much for your time. It's been great to speak to you.
Oh, thank you for having me. I loved it.